Hi there, you're watching Midwinter Minis, my name's Guy.
And I'm Hatty, and in this video we're going to talk about our experience of Warhammer Fest 2023, what we painted, how we did, and the event itself.
Now this video has been kindly sponsored by 1001 and their new Ultra Krill paint line. More on that later, but first let's talk about both of us entering our first ever painting competition, Golden Demon 2023. So back in October last year, when I bought tickets for Warhammer Fest, I didn't even really consider buying the separate ticket entry to submit a model for Golden Demon because, while lots of people tell me I can paint well, what I feel like I'm best at doing is getting stuff looking comparatively pretty good in a short space of time. Whether it's speed painting single minis or batch painting squads or whole armies, that's the thing I do. The thing I'm known for, and I'm happy with that, really. I also attended last year's Golden Demon and saw the absolutely stunning paint jobs and minis in the cabinets firsthand, and honestly, these artists put hundreds of hours into their work. And I felt like I would be an imposter, a waste of someone else's chance if I bought a ticket. But in the following months, I had a lot of people reach out to me and ask me if I was entering a model, and it got me thinking that even though I was dead sure I wouldn't win anything, it still might be nice for fans of the channel to see something that I've done in the flesh. Even my mate Steve, who has won a silver in last year's Golden Demon, told me I should definitely enter. So I caved to peer pressure and I bought a ticket. The only problem was, by the time I'd finally come around to the idea, the tickets for Golden Demon had sold out. So I just put that idea on the back burner and we carried on making cool videos for everyone to enjoy. Fast forward to, well, 2 weeks ago, and I got an email from Eventbrite saying that a last minute Golden Demon ticket had come up and do I want to buy it? And obviously I grabbed one.
And so did I, with the same reasoning as Guy. I thought it would be fun to enter my Nightmare Before Christmas themed, fully converted Great Unclean one. Because, well, I like it, I'm really proud of it, it took a lot of work, and I thought some other people would also like to see it in the flesh. And technically it's still an official Games Workshop model, somewhere, under all that milliput. Guy, on the other hand, likes to make things difficult for himself and decided to set himself a challenge to paint something brand new just for the competition.
So, in true Midwinter Minis fashion, I looked at my calendar and, taking into account the days I was finishing other projects, taking care of the kids and seeing family, I had 3 days I could work on it until Maverick's paint arrived with us and we had to leave for Warhammer Fest. And by the way, half of this video is going to be about painting my entry and the other half is going to be more about Warhammer Fest in general. So if you want to jump straight to that bit, I won't be offended. Check out the timestamps in the video description to find the right bit. Anyway, my first day was all about model prep and planning. A couple of years ago, I made one of my favourite videos where I asked Travarian, a multi-Golden Demon Award winner, to critique my best paint job to date and ask him where I could improve. I basically tried to implement all of the notes he gave me, and one of the biggest was to leave no stone unturned when it comes to model prep. All mould lines have to be totally removed without ruining the detail of the mini. All seams and gaps need to be filled perfectly, basically leaving no trace that what you've made comes from a kit, but is rather a solid, real thing. So on top of all the tidying steps, I also added even more detail to the model, cutting the crease into the closed fist with the tip of my knife, drilling out the exhaust on the claw, as well as the main chambers and every single vent on the 3 exhaust pipes on the Squig's engine. I don't usually keep my workspace that tidy, but I don't want random plastic flecks mixing in with my paint, so I tidied as I went. Honestly, I know this step is probably one that most people find boring, but this model prep took a full working day. Cutting, buffing, filing, smoothing, melting, filling, drilling. I tried to keep everything in vaguely unique sub-assemblies to make painting not easier, just less difficult, if you know what I mean. I know I might be in a bit of a minority here, but I'm not a huge fan of the big plinths that most of the high-performing Golden Demon entries use. I feel like they should still be usable as game pieces, so I also scratch-built the model's base using various smashed tile and barricade parts from my bits box, added small rocks, debris, texture paste, and fine grating mesh buried into the dirt. I primed the Squig's body grey, and in doing so spotted more imperfect mould lines, so I gave them another buff and a melt, primed again, and, well, then I left the studio for the night. And that was the end of day 1 of 3. This little break seems like a perfect time to tell you about the sponsor of this video, 1001, a new but passionate grassroots hobby brand made of fellow nerds, mini painters, diorama builders, and wargamers. Phil, the guy who actually thought up this new paint range, was dissatisfied with the performance of paints that were currently available. Phil is a chemist and had been experimenting with making his own paint formula, specifically for miniature painting. He shared it with his friends, and after they all loved it, they made the brave and terrifying decision of teaming up to bring it to market. They're also fans of the channel and sent me some half-size preview pots. They are high-performance, vibrant paints with superb coverage. Even the brightest colours can base coat over black, which is, well, it's bonkers. They're also brush lickers, so make sure that none of the pigments, resins, or preservatives are hazardous. Their Kickstarter goes live on the 15th of May, and you can try out the range with a pack of 8, or get various sizes all the way up to the full range in a fancy wooden box. There's both monopigment and mixed pigment paint to satisfy both pro painters and hobbyists alike, and no word of a lie here, they're fantastic. So good, I even use some of the colours for this model I'm painting right now. You'll see them when I'm doing the big, bold colours later on. Follow the link in the description to check out their Kickstarter and help make it a success. The hobby needs more awesome, innovative startups like 1001. Now, to kick off day 2, I wanted to add loads of interesting texture to the skin. I knew I would be really limited with time, so I diluted white paint with loads of water and started sponging it on all over the mini. Let it dry and then did a few more layers. This process is all about lots of easy, subtle steps. I also painted the entire inside of the mouth and tongue solid white as well. To add a basic tone to the whole model, I diluted the contrast paint Garagax Sewer about 1 part paint to 2 parts thinner and applied it all over the skin. Now I know what you're thinking, contrast paint? You're never going to win with that, buddy. You have to manually paint everything. Now I know what you're saying, but stick with me here. This is basically just to create an underpainting that I'll work up from. I then did another couple of layers of very diluted white sponging over the top of the skin. While I wait for that paint to dry, I painted the inside of the mouth and tongue with volupus pink and also pushed some up into the gummy areas around the teeth. And to add easy extra subtlety, I added some to the cracks of the squig skin where the mechanical elements are buried in him. Getting a bit more intentional now, I grabbed that thinned white again and, using the random sponging patterns created on the skin as a guide, I started sketchily highlighting the areas to boost the texture. I then used the sewer contrast paint again to subtly line the recesses of the creases and the areas that border other elements, and also the shadows around the bigger texture blobs on the skin. I thinned it even more and painted on some belly creases. Now most of this is going to be entirely invisible unless you're looking at this model from a crazy angle, but I reckon the judges will give it a really thorough inspection, so better safe than sorry. Right, grabbing 2 nice pastel colours from the Coat d'Arms line, making the most of their quite transparent consistency, I filtered the skin on the squig by airbrushing lupin grey on the underside of the body and putrid green on the top side. This interacts with the colours underneath and slightly mutes the depth of the shadows and the intensity of the highlights. Then, mixing white into both the Coat d'Arms paints to create a unique highlight colour, I sketched on some subtle textures. This looks really bright, but as with all lighter paints, it softens out quite well when it dries. I then blacked out all of the elements that will be metallic and gave them a coat of TT Combat gunmetal. Once that was dry, I did a rough highlight with the old Citadel bolt gun metal paint. I am running out of this and I only use it for special occasions, but I reckon my first Golden Demon entry meets that criteria. For the pipes and the footrests, I used Coat d'Arms Magic Metal, which is pretty similar to the old Citadel Tin Bits paint, which used to be one of my favourites. I then shaded all of the metallic bits with very thin Garagax Sewer. While that dries, let's start on the straps. Now, old Mozrog is a character for the Snakebite clan of orcs, so it only seems fitting to use this 30-year-old pot of snakebite leather as the main colour. All of the straps and saddle bits got base coated with this. One and done. They didn't mess around back then. Speaking of which, Simon, a friend of the channel, dropped by with some vintage 90s paints he said he wasn't going to make any use of and kindly donated them to the cause. Thanks matey, putting them to good use already. All of the brown bits got a slight tint and recess shade with thin down rattling grime, and then I mixed snakebite leather and bronze flesh to start building up highlights on those areas, never just slapping down a solid coat, instead stippling and sketching on vaguely leathery patterns. If you start quite randomly, you can then build up the areas that look best with more highlights. Pretty happy with that brown for now. Let's nail those teeth, starting with a khaki base coat and then shading with some skeleton horde contrast paint to get the darkness into the cracks on the teeth, and then built up highlights mixing Vallejo's pale sand into khaki, leaving just pure pale sand highlights along the edges and sharpest points and ridges. I also base coated the eyeballs white, then a base coat of blood red, highlighting the center with white again and applying some Vallejo fluorescent magenta to make it really bold. Let's give his single biological foot a cute little pedicure. Starting with German grey base coat, I built up through Incubi darkness into pale sand highlights, which should be an interesting tonal contrast to the rest of the model without being an overpoweringly bold colour choice. Now, I do kind of want to keep this model looking like a fancier, or at least more detailed version of the box art, so white armour plates are essential. White is a total pain in the butthole to paint on models. You basically don't want to use any pure white at all, except for the tiniest highlights. Stupid, I know, but here we are. I tidied up all of the armour areas that I want to be white with slate grey, so it's a nice smooth colour to work up from, not the untidy mess we made from sponging. I then mixed in some of the coat d'arms lupin grey to slate grey and started layering up. Intentionally imperfect, if you know what I mean. This isn't neat and tidy Space Marine armour. This is armour fashioned by really angry green dudes in a swamp shanty. Starting to add more white to the mix on the palette and making it thinner and thinner, I ended up just glazing over the layers with slightly whiter paint until it looked a bit like this. I mean, that'll do for now. I'm seriously running out of time. All of the big metal parts like the gun, the mechanical leg, exhausts, and Mozrog's mech body parts got the speed paint but actually looks pretty good treatment of base coating with magic metal, washing with a mix of Garagak sewer and rattling grime, sponging with bolt gun metal, and when that was dry, another wash, and cycling through those stages a few more times until there's multiple layers showing. I then picked out a few manual highlights with either bolt gun metal or Vallejo's aluminium, depending on how prominent I wanted that highlight to look. Now, there's a lot of the same stuff going on here, and I don't want to bore you to death with repeated steps, so I also painted the armor plates on the mech leg white. There'll be a lot of big old bright colors on this mini by the end, and I don't want too many clashes, so I used Incubi Darkness and Mirage Blue, both pretty desaturated, to paint and highlight the pipe on the Squig's mech leg, painting on some ridges that aren't sculpted onto the model itself, trying to show off my brush control whenever I can. Let's hope the judges like that. Before I attached the leg, I made the area around it a bit more gruesome with some thinned reds and stuck it on. I marked out the area where the model should stand on the base, a bit wobbly, but we can add some rubble under one foot to make him stand level. I reckon I can glue on the exhaust now without obscuring anything too badly. Right, what you've seen of the painting stages so far has been about 9 AM to 6 PM, so a pretty typical day in the studio, but I've only got one day left after this, so I need to make the most of this day. FYI, this is Wednesday, and traditionally that means it's games night for the Midwinter Minis crew, where me, Steve, Hatty, and Ant get together and just have fun without the pressure of making content from it. We play all sorts of board games like Pandemic, Risk, Ticket to Ride, Suro, Hero Quest, Muffin Time, or retro video games on the Saturn or Dreamcast. But tonight, the boys came over to the studio for a hobby hangout. Steve was very carefully stippling subtle textures on his amazing Son of Slambo Golden Demon entry, and Ant was airbrushing base coats on some of his big Tyranids, getting ready for their moment in the sun with the release of 10th edition. I dry brushed some white onto my base to see what I was working with a bit more clearly, and then base coated the metal scraps with a different mix of blues and purples, and then sponged on some metallic paint. I moistened everything and added a very thin coat of dirty down rust, and once that was completely dry, I sponged on some bright silver paint to create the effect of recent chips showing through the dirt and grime. I also sponged and manually painted some blue bits and purple highlight colours to add a bit of variation and saturation to the metal parts. The exposed metal elements were base coated silver and washed with rattling grime. I then added a few more spots of much more intentional, thicker dirty down rust. For the dirt on the ground, I kept it complex, but not really very intentional, but just randomly applying different reddy earth tone paints and washes. Lots of this stuff I've already used on the model, but being very scrappy and quick with it, necessity is the mother of invention, and I need this base finished tonight, or I'll have no chance of finishing the rest of the model tomorrow. Okay, so to get the squig sitting perfectly level, I just had to commit, and added some super glue to the base, and also sprinkled some powdered metal abrasive stuff I have where the foot will sit, and quickly pressed it all down. This created a crazy strong bond, and then I just blew off the excess powder with an airbrush. Okay, the heat is on now, into the final day. Thursday morning, I got into the studio early, about 8 AM, and cracked on. Mogrok's trousers got a base coat with German grey and highlighted up with slate grey, keeping it quite simple. His straps and belt leather got base coated with Thondia brown and highlighted through Steel Legion drab to Ironrack flesh, trying to keep the tones unique only to these parts to show I put in the effort. For the skin tone, maybe you'll know I usually paint my orcs with a pretty vibrant, slightly cartoonish look, but that's not going to cut it for Golden Demon. Instead, I went for a more muted base coat of TT Combat's Marsh Green, and then I gave it a thinned wash of the 90s Orc Flesh Wash to darken the recesses. And then I used, what else? The 90s Goblin Green paint to start building up the skin tone. Again, never just painting a fully flat area, instead sketching on muscles and sinew lines, interesting skin textures, knobbles and warts, bumps and scratches, trying to pack as much character into the model as possible in the short time I have left. Once that was all sorted, I glazed on some more very thin Orc Flesh Wash all over the skin to unify the colours a bit. I then also glazed on some thinned Magos purple into the deepest recesses and on the undersides of the big muscular bits. To add some extra flavour to the mechanical bits, I grabbed some burnt umber ink, thinned it with a little water, and stippled it around on some random spots to make it look a little bit more patinaed. Okay, so using these new 1001 paints for the orange armour accent colour. Crazily, this stuff makes a pretty solid base coat over blacks and dark metallics in just 2 thin coats, which if you've ever tried that with an orange or a yellow before, I mean, well, you just can't until now. I added some yellow in and highlighted up to the top of each little funky rune on his arm, and then, why not? Let's glue the body to the legs. I added one of these snakebite design transfers on the mech's leg armor plate, just like the model on the box art has, and then added a yellow checker pattern to the end of his big gun. Now, using just the 1001 paints, I airbrushed the back banner with a deep red, and then started layering on orange, and finally yellow to make it a big, bright focal point on the model. I did do a quick edge highlight along all of the top faces with the yellow and touched tiny bits of Thondia brown along all of the edges to make it look like small chips, but for some reason the camera wasn't rolling on that bit, so you'll just have to take my word for it. The big horns then got base coated with deep crimson and highlighted by mixing in flesh and bony tones, and I'm out of time. You know what? I'm pretty happy with that. Mozrog Skragbad, my first ever entry to a painting competition, ready for its trip to Warhammer Fest and Golden Demon. I would have absolutely loved to spend a bit more time on it, but hey, isn't that always the case? I think limiting myself really made me say, okay, that's it. That's all I can do. About 10 hours on the first day and 2 15-hour days in the studio in the last 2, so about 40 hours total on this little dude, using the most effective, time-saving but striking model painting techniques I've honed during all my time painting minis so far, all in one character.
So, after Guy's marathon self-imposed painting challenge, we travelled up to Manchester with the one and only Mavericks Paint. He'd come over from Canada for Fest and he was staying with Guy while he was in the UK. Hilariously though, we had to travel up in my car, which is quite little, because Guy's is electric and wouldn't have had the range. And we had no idea that Mav is pretty much a space marine, so it was a bit cramped in my little Fiesta.
Now, day 1 of Warhammer Fest was, no joke, a bit of a blur. I barely had time to even get my camera out because we basically spent the whole day just chatting to people and meeting people non-stop. I actually had to walk and talk with people a lot of the time just to go and do basic stuff like go and buy food and drink and go to the toilet. Hatty and I both entered our models into Golden Demon, and after a while we managed to spot Mozrog in the cabinet, but we couldn't see Hatty's great unclean boogie anywhere.
It turns out the judges had thought it was no longer Games Workshop intellectual property, so it had to be disqualified from the competition. Which is a bit of a shame, and I'm not gonna lie, it made me a little bit sad, but I suppose it turned out for the best, because it meant I got to carry him around with me for the rest of the day, and loads of fans of the channel got to see him up close and personal, and it was really cool to see people's reactions to it face to face. And butt to face.
Now, I'm sure by now you've seen that there were a lot of people at Fest, and a lot of queues to take part in the various activities, many of which were hours long, and by activities, we include stuff like just buying things at the shop, never mind playing the new edition of 40k.
Anyway, by day 2, we were pumped and ready to go again. My brother also came along, and yes, I know we have exactly the same face. We're also both pretty tall too. Average human for scale. Not as tall as Guy and Mav though. They're not quite Primaris sized, but goodness me, they're not far off.
We also checked out the cabinets again, and they'd shuffled the models around a little bit. Mine was moved to the Warhammer 40k large model cabinets rather than the single miniature, and it joined not 1, not 2, but 8 other Mozrog models. My hopes of achieving any awards were a little bit dashed when I realised that my model wasn't even the best painted Mozrog, never mind the best painted model in the category. Anyway, my spirits were seriously lifted by meeting loads of awesome viewers, fans, Patreon supporters, and merch wearers. Totally surreal seeing all of the Midwinter Minis t-shirts and hoodies around, and running into loads of other amazing content creators whose videos I enjoy watching too. James from Rising Ape even bought me a coffee. What a hero. While the stalls for the various video games looked awesome and really added to the feel of the place, none of us really fancied joining the huge queues to try them out, and the queue for trying out 10th edition was still over 3 hours long even at the quietest points of the day, so we just wandered around and met more people. Probably the absolute highlight of the whole event for me was meeting Ali, who had painted up this incredible little card. I'm not gonna lie, I properly teared up. What an absolute legend. We checked out the huge Titan walk, which I wasn't actually aware was even happening because I forgot to register my Titan with the Titan Owners Club and missed the memo. Maybe next year. We watched the cosplay parade in the main hall, and then we were invited by Iron Warrior Cosplay to try on a couple of armor pieces. Made you look. Honestly, the effort that some of these super talented people go to is astonishing. This giant Necron was a big fan of the channel as well, and we had a nice chat through his legit pretty terrifying mask. There was a tiny bit of an awkward moment at the end of day 2, but I don't want to dwell on it too much. Just a bit of a miscommunication that ended up with me, Steve, Hatty and Maverick leaving in the rain, while all of our pals got to have secret fun at the Creator After Dark event. Now I'm not going to go into it here, but if you want to know what went down, go listen to the post-fest podcast we made with Maverick, link in the description. Anyway, so day 3, this was when Mav and I finally bit the bullet and joined the queue for trying out 10th edition. Luckily for us though, we'd met some really nice people and fans of the channel in the queue, which helped pass the time. When our turn finally came around to jump on one of the 5 tables running demo games, we had a pretty good time. It still plays like the 40k we already know and love, but a bit more refined in terms of how and where to reference rules, with abilities and unique rules baked into the stats on the data cards instead of being spread across multiple books, which is nice to see. Our host, Mike, was also awesome, and was still full of smiles and energy after some seriously long old days. The new models look great as well. Now, unfortunately, we're not one of those channels that receive advanced copies of stuff like this from Games Workshop, but we're really keen to make a Learn to Play video as soon as we get one. We also had about an hour before the Golden Demon Awards ceremony kicked off, so we hung around with some of the cool cosplayers again. Just in case you were in any doubt as to whether I was Imperium or Chaos aligned.
Let the galaxy burn!
Hatty even got to have a wrong trousers moment. Right, let's pick up our entries and head to the auditor. Hold on a second. Is that a finalist pin? Did my rush job Mozrog get a pin? I honestly had to double check it was mine and not one of the others, because I think this is the first competition I've ever won anything in since I was a child. I know it might be hard to believe, but I have big imposter syndrome when it comes to things like this. I've based my whole channel around making miniature painting accessible to everyone, which often involves pretty basic techniques and paint jobs that are good enough and not the best I can possibly do. Which even this model isn't really. I only got to spend about 40 hours on it, and now I have a pin, I still kind of feel like I don't deserve it. That I somehow cheated someone else out of getting one, if you know what I mean. It's hard to describe.
Well, a pin's a pin, and you're clearly good enough to get one. Anyway, let's head to that award ceremony. There was another big queue to get in, with us having to wait for about an hour, so we had a nice little sit, and then boom, here we go. We'll leave you with a cool winners montage. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time. Bye bye!
Bye for now.